Welcome back to Blame Theory. I'm Jeff Schullenberger. This is the podcast where we take a seriously playful look at the ideas that have shaped our minds and our world to ask how have we ended up here and whom or what can we blame. So I'm joined again by Ashley Frawley, and we'll be starting off by discussing a piece she wrote in Compact last month called School Shooters and the Gender Wars. But, the larger question is, first of all, when there are these instances of spectacular violence, public violence that, is taken to be making some kind of a statement, there are often these blame narratives that emerge around it. And often these narratives have been gendered. Most commonly, they've been about, male toxicity, the male propensity to violence, male rage, misogyny, etc. Especially since I would say the Elliot Rodger shooting, which was actually both in terms of the mainstream narrative and in terms of the strange subcultural narratives around the so-called manosphere, or these kind of various male-dominated subcultures, incels, and so on. That was really a watershed. The Elliot Rodger shooting was a watershed. Elliot Rodger became a kind of strange and disturbing sort of patron saint figure for some of these subcultures. So I would sort of trace things to that, and we might talk about that a little bit. But Ashley, I mean, first of all, the news cycles being what they are, this incident has already been somewhat forgotten. But just remind us of the details of this particular shooting that occurred in December of 2024, last year, and what you noticed about the narratives that emerged around it.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I wanted to talk about, what we kind of discussed was, it's not just, this is just one example of something that I noticed got an immediate gender framing. So there's a kind of broader cultural current that I have noticed where people are more likely to, or there's a greater trend toward blaming gender. And I don't necessarily, when I say gender, mean what that's come to mean, just transgender, although we'll come to that, I think. But in terms of blaming men or toxic masculinity, or what we see if you dwell too much online, blaming women. And so basically the bad behavior of men or women. So the difference was, as you said, usually you get these long treatises on toxic masculinity. This also emerged after the Santa Fe shooting in 2018, where there were some rumors that the boy who carried out that shooting, had a crush on a girl. And so you have like the Blackburn Center releasing this sort of article about toxic masculinity and why are we, we're socializing men into these strict gender roles. We're teaching them to express their emotions through anger and violence. And that's what's causing this. But what was different about this particular shooting was that it is one of the very few shootings that have ever been carried out by a female, a girl, a biological female. And that was so shocking that it led to this kind of these sort of swirling rumors online about what it was about this person's gender that led them to carry out this attack. But essentially, it was at a Christian school in early December. 3 people were killed, including the shooter. And even now, there hasn't been any sort of release about exactly what the motives were, which I find kind of interesting because in a lot of cases you get the manifesto immediately. And then sometimes it's like a slow trickle and then nothing. And just sort of, you can tell that the officials are kind of waiting for interest to die down before they kind of put a manifesto or release any details. So I found that kind of interesting. But I did say at the end of the article that I wrote last month for Compact that, we're not going to hear anything more about this. No one's going to care in a couple of weeks because, it's just going to be another statistic. According to CNN, there were 83 school shootings in 2024. It's just going to be another number. It was just like, it just joins the other 82 and we forget about it. We move on to something else. But why I think it's worth talking about is just the way that it immediately, as soon as this news came out that this person was ostensibly a girl, you had people saying, no, it must be a trans woman or it must be a trans man. That was immediate because it is, to be fair, it is very, very rare. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there have been a very small number of violent incidents carried out of this nature, mass shootings carried out by females, not just school shootings, mass shootings of any kind carried out by females. And so immediately online, you had people saying that the shooter must be trans. So one person says, Sean Barnes, the cop, insists it doesn't matter if Natalie Rupno, which is the name of the alleged, do we say alleged if the person shot themselves at the same time? Anyway, sorry for the awful language there, but if Natalie Rupno of the school shooting is trans, it's all that matters. The trans mafia is a violent group of mostly white male bullies who are treated like royalty. And other people sort of said, it's the outcome of transgenderism and feminism. You radicalize these people, and now they're picking up guns. So this was the very first narrative that came out was this person must be trans. Then it comes out actually it's a born biological female, and then you get somebody who tweets, the shooter is exactly what you probably expected. Alongside screenshots of Rupno's supposed forum posts that declared, women are the only hope for this wretched world. I don't know about you, but when I hear about a school shooting, an enraged feminist is not really the first thing that comes to my mind. But if you spend enough time, I guess, steeped in the online gender war, it is ratcheting up so much, and there is so much vitriol. Yeah, I would, if I was like, just like at a passing glance, it does seem like it's going to get violent at any second. So for this person to say it's exactly what you expected, any normal person on the street, no, that's not exactly what they expected. But if you're online, yeah, it's exactly what you expected. It is, people are so angry. Like you have like the feminists who became radicalized around the trans issue, for not unreasonably, but they have got to, it was like, I knew this would happen too. Like you had the trans movement grew up right after the Me Too movement. And there was always a portion of people who were Me Tooers that were just going to jump on any bandwagon. So they're on the Me Too bandwagon, and then they see the next one go by, they just hopped onto it. But there were a few who really were like, oh my God, we live in a rape culture. Oh my God, men have this like their heart is just black and they're rapists and they just have this like thin veneer of acceptability. And they were never going to be like, oh, but that one's wearing a dress, so that's fine. So they were never going to get on board with that. And part of the reason why was because they believed in an inherent kind of male violence or a pervasive male violence. And so as that, as people have really come at each other online, they've really become more and more, like the trans activists were saying, like, were fantasizing about murdering, J.K. Rowling or quote unquote TERFs. This awful kind of fantasies of murder. And at the same time, you have any kind of violence committed by a trans person was just like, see, I told you. And it just seemed like, yeah, obviously things are going to turn violent. So there is a crazy gender war erupting online, but it's not the first time this has happened. If you look at Google Ngram for gender war, it peaks in 1998. And we're actually on the downward trajectory of that. But of course, this is in published discourse. So this sort of like battle of the sexes, as we used to call it, has turned really, really violent. And it was scapegoated in this particular shooting. But the thing is, we don't actually know what drove the shooter. And that was also one of the things that was interesting about this was there were all these like fabricated forum posts. And it was like, I think it was Catherine D wrote an article about this. And she said, well, for these people, it didn't matter what was true or not. It might as well be true. It might as well be true. And so people were like, I know it. it might as well be true. So I'll just post this forum post and attribute it to her to further my kind of narrative. Now, but of course, like, internet discourse, the news cycle being what it is, no one knows what was true or not or whatever. It was just yet another example of how messed up women are and how messed up feminists are for the incels or for the manosphere. And it was just another example of, although I do think it was still in the news cycle by the time the whole trans narrative was kind of disproven. But, the 10 seconds people might have been interested in it, it was just another example of trans rage or whatever it might have been. And all of these things might as well be true, given the kind of vitriolic nature of the gender war online, according to the people who are sort of passing this off.
Yes, I think this sort of indeterminacy is, partly just a feature of the media landscape, which we could identify in various areas. I wrote about it actually in relation to media coverage of the Gaza war last year, but but I think there is also this specific. I was reminded of this passage from Baudrillard that I often quote.
I was gonna say,
right,
it was
this
so Baudrillard.
Yes, so this is from Baudrillard writing in 1980 or so. Is any given bombing in Italy, and here he's talking about the years of lead, the terrorist bombings of of that era of the 1970s. Is any given bombing in Italy the work of leftist extremists or extreme right provocation or a centrist mise-en-scène to discredit all extreme terrorists and shore up its own failing power? Or again, is it a police-inspired scenario and a form of blackmail to public security? All of this is simultaneously true, and the search for proof, and indeed the objectivity of the facts, does not put an end to this vertigo of interpretation. That is, we are in a logic of simulation, which no longer has anything to do with a logic of facts and an order of reason. So, I was reminded in your account and the way these sort of narratives swirl around it, and none of them. It's not as if any one particularly prevails, right? What instead happens is you have this kind of array of narratives that just continue to circulate and kind of take on a life of their own. And yeah, it is striking. What's the sort of precursor event to this one, which I think partly informed it, was this Nashville shooting that happened in 2023, where in fact the shooter was a trans man, was a girl who had transitioned, who had attended the school that she ended up shooting up. Had transitioned, and so it sort of became, and the question of like, why aren't they releasing the manifesto became a big sort of cause on the right. What kind of disturbed me about this was that we had seen for many years sort of these narratives of fear surrounding these types of incidents, which were used to, and I mean, I'll just sort of come clean and give my own standard way of interpreting these, which is that this is it's a kind of violence that is driven by a logic of its own and then attaches itself to different kind of rationales that can be really any ideological flavor you can imagine, right? Or none at all, right? They can simply be apolitical or not political, not represent any coherent politics at all. So I think what I find troubling about these narratives is the way that they tend to try to impute some ideology as the causal agent or as the main factor that drives someone to commit an act of violence, whereas I would tend to interpret it in the opposite way, that there's a kind of logic of imitative violence. It's a mimetic phenomenon. You can trace this very easily, right? That these types of shootings are often understood by their own perpetrators to be sort of acts of homage to some prior shooting. Like this is even often explicit in their own in the rationales they themselves develop. But at the same time, in some cases it attaches itself to an ideology. I think if we go back to the sort of source event for modern mass shootings, and specifically school shootings, which is the Columbine shooting, if there was sort of an attempt to try to figure out what the worldview of these kids was, were they some kind of neo-Nazis? They intriguingly had this fantasy in their sort of the materials they wrote sort of before actually carrying this out, that they were going to hijack a plane and crash it into the World Trade Center. So they sort of anticipated, strangely, this, and again, going back to Baudrillard, it's like, this actual event that inaugurated our new millennium, that was at the same time a sort of foreordained event, because it's sort of so heavily populated people's fantasy life even before it happened. But basically, the Columbine, the sort of phantasmagoria of their sort of fantasies and bizarre desires that drove them to do this, didn't really have any clear ideological positioning. You could sort of find strains of it that would attach it to different ones, but it was more that they were searching for some kind of orientation or some kind of ideology that might provide it with some sort of meaning, right? But and then I think, and
as
again,
were the shooters themselves.
Yes, right. And the way I interpret part of this is that, you still have these kind of ideologically amorphous shooters, in subsequent decades, but, as sort of online sorting into these sort of niche ideological communities happens, it in a sense becomes easier to find ideologies that you can use to justify this type of action. And so that's more or less how I interpret this. Whereas I think, the way these blame narratives often operate is that you have to blame the ideas and blame anyone who has sort of normalized them or been responsible for spreading them. And so I think it's, and so I think, part of what I would identify as harmful about these discourses is that they're ultimately driven by a desire to in a sense shut down ideas that are seen as dangerous. And they're seen as an opportunity or a pretext for doing that. And so I think that's one aspect of this. But then on the other hand, I think they're, and getting back into the gender stuff, it is striking to me that, again, it was obvious implicitly that this was, like most forms of violence, overwhelmingly male phenomenon. That said, I think it wasn't until, as I said, around Elliot Rodger that you sort of had this explicit association of it with, these male subcultures, which, and to give to give to give their due to some of the people who articulated this narrative, it is true that you have the Angela Nagel wrote about this in Kill All Normies. Like, you have the emergence in the particularly early 2010s of these subcultures, which are just infused with these fantasies of violence and are sort of inspired by and driven by these fantasies of violence. And then when you have Elliot Rodger, and there are a few other incidents around the same time, actually carry this out, you have on one hand, the fulfillment of the fantasies of this subset of sort of, internet of incels and so on. And then on the other hand, you have the fulfillment of this sort of emerging feminist narrative around, the dangers of men, and that, that there is just something fundamentally toxic and irredeemable about masculinity that again, that sort of needs to be constrained and curtailed. And so it becomes a deeper kind of narrative than just this, there are certain like extreme ideas that are driving people to carry out violent acts, which I think can be a kind of dangerous narrative that offers a pretext for all kinds of censorship. But that it goes much further to say, that there's something just extremely dangerous about men, and men sort of need to be kept in check. And what's interesting is that in some sense, the the online subcultures that are bubbling up around the same time, themselves sort of embrace this, right? They sort of say, well, what it means to be a man is to be this kind of rage filled, this kind of rage filled vector of violence, right? And that the problem with modern civilization is that it's deprived men of outlets for exercising this intrinsic violence. So that there's a weird way that the mainstream narrative and these subcultural ones sort of mutually reinforce each other, because they in a sense conclude the same thing about men. So yeah, I think that there's sort of this interesting strain that again has to do with like identifying ideologies, and then there's another strain that has to do with identifying some kind of sense of something we talked about in another podcast of human nature, but specifically male nature, as being something that very much needs to be constrained and curtailed. But then, as I think you're suggesting, there's a sort of opposite reactive narrative to that, which is about which comes out of this kind of critique of feminism, but renders it in very extreme terms, right? And implies that, what this shooting shows us is that there's something, genocidal about feminism. Right. and then, it's interesting. This also reminds me back of a very old incident, which is which in some ways kind of brings all this together, which is the shooting of Andy Warhol by Valerie Solanas, a sort of fascinating figure who you can imagine being a sort of character on the internet, right? Who wrote this this manifesto called the Scum Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men. And so, are you familiar with this story?
No, I'm not familiar.
Valerie Solanas. There was actually a movie about it made in the 90s, I believe, called I Shot Andy Warhol. But yeah, Valerie Solanas was a sort of odd, obviously kind of disturbed person who I think had, she had experienced some like horrific abuse, both in her childhood and I think in an early marriage. It sort of became a lesbian and kind of connected to certain, I suppose, kind of radical like lesbian separatist ideas in the 70s. But then she was also just kind of a hanger on in the New York sort of art scene at the time. And so she started hanging out at the Andy Warhol factory. And, meanwhile, she wrote this document called the Scum Manifesto, and, supposedly founded this group called the Society for Cutting Up Men. And I'm not clear. I don't think the group ever had any members or any institutional being, but it is a fascinating document of the era. And it was a notable instance of kind of public violence against a major figure. One of the, I suppose in that era, the assassination, although the assassination has come back in the past year, fascinatingly, it seemed to be a kind of obsolete form of American violence, but it's for some reason had a resurgence in the past year. But with the two Trump assassination attempts and the Luigi Mangione UHC shooting. But the point is, Valerie Solanas was a sort of figure of this this period of assassinations of public figures, John Lennon, various presidents who were assassinated or nearly assassinated. So she she attempts to kill Andy Warhol. She does injure him, but doesn't kill him. I can't remember exactly how her life goes after that, but not particularly well. But basically, she was kind of known as this like fringe figure of 70s radical feminism and sort of lesbian separatism. It's not entirely clear why she shot Andy Warhol per se. It seems like maybe he was a bit mean to her. But himself not exactly an embodiment of male, of a sort of toxic like dominant male personality, but nonetheless, but she so she's kind of a bit forgotten about, but then this movie is made about her in the 90s, and then interestingly she's rediscovered by the noted trans writer Andrea Long Chu, who writes about her um, in roughly 10 years ago, let's say 2015, 2016, and sort of reclaims her as like a trans, as a sort of person that whose ideas can be used to like theorize transness, right? And so Chu sort of, for Chu, like cutting up men becomes a very different notion if you think of it from a trans
Right.
perspective. So in any case, this is a kind of bizarre trajectory, but it's interesting to see this idea, and I didn't think about it that much at the time, but this idea that that this shooter was represented some sort of femcel or like radical anti-male feminist ideology, because it does kind of loop us back to that strange incident from long ago, where you had Solanus as a kind of prototype. I mean, not only a figure of the sort of radical lesbian separatist movement of the time, but also a prototype of the sort of incel shooter, right? Who's like just motivated by sheer hatred of the opposite sex, and the sense that the opposite sex is just this, entirely oppressive force that needs to be met with, violence and sort of destructive force. So I don't know. So I've been going on a while, but I'm curious what your
Yeah, I
thoughts
have
are
like
on those
12
various things. Yeah.
12 points brewing in my mind now. How am I going to string these together? So that's so interesting. So you said like I wasn't familiar with that, and it's interesting because you asked sort of why Andy Warhol, and there's this kind of like visibility aspect to a lot of this stuff, obviously, where another obscure incident that popped into my mind as I was thinking about these things was this weird murder from like almost 15 years ago by a guy. His real name, and I want to say his real name because he doesn't deserve the stupid ass name he chose for himself, but his name was Eric Clinton Kirk Newman, but called himself Luca Rocco Magnotta. Do you remember that? He was a apparently schizophrenic guy, I don't know, but who murdered a Chinese exchange student in Canada in 2012. And I found that story really interesting from the perspective of this kind of visibility, invisibility, but also the this fear that underneath a lot of these shootings is this idea of like, I am invisible. I'm invisible to the opposite sex. I'm invisible to the world. My life hasn't got any purpose or meaning, and there's a sense that I might disappear. Um, and uh, and Magnotta was an interesting case for this because although he wasn't very bright, one thing that he did know was that, or one thing he did understand was that the online world could become a kind of playground for the construction of reality. And this sort of loose world of online information, um, and our increasing reliance upon it as well, and journalists' increasing reliance upon it could become this way where he could construct a life for himself or notoriety for himself, some visibility for himself that didn't exist, that he didn't have access to in the real world. So it was a way for him to be visible. So what he initially does is he concocts this story that that he's a gay porn star. I think he probably must have done some low cost gay videos at some point, and that he was dating Carla Homolka, notorious Canadian serial killer. Plants this information all over the place, and then somehow manages to capture the attention of the mainstream media. The mainstream media Google him, and sure enough, he comes up as having dated Carla Homolka. Then they report it and interview him. So it's like, you're talking about simulacra, right? So like the online world offers us this ability to create something that has no referent. It is its own world. And it's interesting because how many middle class people sort of gravitate towards social constructionism, because it really does feel as though reality is fluid. Like the more you are embedded in the world of text and desk work and that kind of thing, the more reality does feel fluid to you. And but it wasn't enough. That's the interesting thing. Like there's a paper by Daniel Dian from, I don't know, back in 2012, I want to say, where he talks about how there are like we are sort of reconceiving rights now. He says being visible or invisible has become a political issue. So visibility looms over us like a Bastille to be conquered, and the conquest is by those who feel themselves to be visibility deprived, and that they perceive three human rights, one of which they're being deprived, or that they're being deprived from. One, the right to be seen. Two, the right to be seen on their own terms. And three, the right of conferring visibility on others. And they feel that they're deprived of this, right? And so it's interesting because you could, and initially the online world was, go back to the 90s, this playground where you could like play with identity and become whoever you wanted to be, and pretend that you're like a housewife, or pretend you're a milkman, or pretend you're a truck driver, pretend you're whatever. And it was like this, we were all like playing with identity. That was like, if you look at early sociology, that's what it's all about, playing with identity online. But it wasn't enough, like, first of all, because it's become so competitive to be visible online. And so it has to go out into the world. And it's just interesting that it's done so that people are expressing this kind of alienation, lack of agency, obviously in a very extreme end of things, through these sort of violent spectacles. I need to create some kind of violent spectacle. And is it Lipovetsky in when he talks about hypermodernity, he says that to be modern was to become an adult, right? So Kant says that, what is enlightenment? It is where we liberate ourselves, we come out of our self-imposed immaturity, and we become adults. But hypermodernity is about staying young forever. And these people, it's interesting because it's always like the cusp. They're always in this liminal stage. Even the CIA knows this is the most dangerous time. This is when people get radicalized. They're like, they're leaving one world, the world of childhood, and they're not quite into the new. And our society has nothing new for them. Like adulthood is like, ugh. So you're like in this kind of liminal failure to launch for ages, and they kind of keep themselves young forever by killing themselves, sometimes literally, but killing themselves in a spectacle that makes them both exist and freezes them in time. And it's interesting because this was now you brought up an interesting example of a female shooter, and there's another example as well, the sort of I hate Mondays kind of female shooter. But this was something that had affected men long before it affected women. Like women, historically, and culturally tend to be the guardians of cultural norms, for better or for worse, tend to be more embedded in society than men are. We're obviously all embedded in society, but at least we are embedded more in the norms and values of society. We're more invested in them. And so it's taken some time for this enemy to kind of leak out into women, but it is. And I don't know if now maybe I'm gendering this too much. Like maybe I am also apportioning blame on gender. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, we have this world where we have a lack of agency, which is being expressed as a fear of invisibility. Because the one place where I can express my agency apparently is in the online world. But I do that and still I'm invisible. And this leads to this kind of frustration. Like, no matter what I effing do, I am still nothing. I am still invisible. And so what can I do to make myself visible? I'll do something crazy. And it's not just, and this crazy act will make me, will make me notable, will make me live this Lipovetsky says, like, we fear mummification, to be like a living dead, and this makes us live but also keeps us young forever. In a way, it freezes you at this one point in time, in this one moment of notoriety, or kills you, and therefore you are actually young forever.
Yeah, and I mean, it's often argued that these acts should be interpreted as suicide. The majority of the perpetrators are, and this is actually something that differentiates them from assassinations historically, where the assassin is often killed in a manhunt or by Jack Ruby or whatever, but you know, the 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 assassin does not seek death in the act of assassination, whereas the act of a mass shooting, of carrying out a mass shooting, seems to generally be part and parcel of a pursuit of death. It's a kind of roundabout form of suicide, and so I think the point about mummification is very important. There's a you can actually, and I brought up the Elliot Rodger cult, right? There is actually a sort of, or I mean, I haven't followed it so much lately, but that there was a sort of pronounced cult of Elliot Rodger. There were lots of representations of him as like an icon or a saint, a martyr, and so there is this kind of this way that these figures actually achieve again a kind of martyrdom. If you think about, I mean, it's a fascinating genre that was extremely important kind of in the Middle Ages into the early modern period, was like the biographies of martyrs, right? And so there's a particular life trajectory of martyrdom that was sort of and interestingly, it kind of became, and this is like where in sort of early Christianity, there's like this bizarre thing where people were kind of seeking out martyrdom, and there was sort of this question of like, is that okay to like actually actively seek martyrdom? It's sort of morally, theologically questionable, but it's clear that there were some who actually deliberately sought out martyrdom, right? Because what other, what could be a higher form of glory? And so, yeah, I mean, I think on one level, when you have an attention economy and the currency is attention, or the currency is some sort of recognition, is visibility, as you put it, then this is simply one way of sort of achieving that end. It's an extremely perverse one, but as you say, if it becomes less perverse when you bring in the idea that this is about remaining forever young. It's about remaining youthful, because then if there's no positive aspiration towards adulthood, towards later stages in life, then what better? And I think it's also worth noting the significance in the sort of cultural ambience of the late 20th century of the dead rock star, right? The rock star who dies before the age of 30 or whatever, right? As sort of some sort of ideal, right? Who in a sense kind of installs in the culture this idea that the most beautiful thing is to be in a sense frozen in time as a sort of beautiful young person. Rock stars, James Dean, figures like this. Arguably, there's sort of an earlier version of this that goes back to the Romantic era with figures, the sort of the tragic romantic poet who dies young, whether it's from tuberculosis or like Byron from, going to struggle for Greek independence or whatever. But, so this has a longer trajectory, but I think in terms of the modern media sphere, this idea that there's sort of an idealized trajectory which really ends before you turn 30 or even 25. So I think that's quite important here. But going back to your point, to this point, but also thinking about how gender plays into it, I'm sort of reminded of Ivan Illich's book Gender, which argues that part of what makes sort of modern capitalist technological civilization distinct from those that preceded it is that it takes the notion of a sort of course of life, right, passing from childhood to adulthood, and in a sense it removes its specifically gender mark dimensions. And so, his argument is sort of that in all forms of culture before ours, you had, the form that your life would take was essentially um, specified by your gender. So, in other words, there wasn't a sort of general shape of a human life. There was a shape of a man's life and a shape of a woman's life. It's not to say there wasn't flexibility within this, but the whole notion of what course your life would take was at least constrained and sort of marked by the category of gender, which meant that you simply occupied a different sort of social sphere, and that those social spheres could be seen as complementary, as sometimes at odds or in tension with each other, but that the course your life would take cannot be conceived of in sort of um, in completely generic terms, right? It has to be conceived of in relation to your gender, and so you know part of why I think these things might be related is that this question of what a sort of optimal adulthood looks like, what a sort of direction that your life might take sort of after your beautiful youth comes to an end, becomes a sort of huge question mark, and something people struggle to find a positive articulation of is that it in a sense is it's opened up to such an extent that sort of any or all versions of this are conceived of as valid, and therefore um, it's unclear by what values you would even determine such a thing. And so what's sort of valued instead is, I suppose, in part some kind of notion of sheer potentiality, which is associated with youth. And then once that kind of sheer potentiality becomes constrained by time and events, um, there's no more value left, right? It's only when you remain in this state of sheer potentiality that you're conceived of as having value. Once you've moved beyond that, you no longer have any clear direction. And so I don't know. I think perhaps there's just a deep relation here with the question of gender and what it is in today's society, where it's often something that people have tried to reframe as an aspect of this kind of realm of sheer potentiality, right? Which is why the idea that you can just kind of change genders, try on different genders, occupy different parts of the gender spectrum, is so attractive, right? Whereas the sort of older notion of gender would imply a particular kind of relatively fixed, although not entirely, but sort of relatively fixed and constrained sort of life course. So I don't know what you think of that, but it seems to me that it's partly the tendency to assign blame here is perhaps partly some sense that it's the other it's the existence of the other gender that is somehow indicating your sort of limitations, or the limits of your sheer potentiality to you.
Yes, exactly. So the other gender is either to blame or they've got it all figured out. So that there's this the sort of shifting genders and occupying different aspects of the spectrum is interesting, because what began as this kind of like playful questioning of boundaries and all boundaries, or of binaries, became this reification of those binaries. It was a very common point that people make, that like that's what feminists often got angry about. It was like, you're wearing woman face, you're just playing out these stereotypes. But there's this sense that when we look at animals and we have this awe for them, like they just seem to know what they're doing. But we as humans, we're like sick. There's a wonderful line that Zizek always quotes, is from someone else, where he says, man is an animal sick with language, and oh how he longs for a cure." We are Hegel says that animals fall upon the world and eat it up. right? They're unmediated. They just fall upon, they become the world. They take the world into themselves. But for us, we are mediated. We are condemned to mediation, to never have a direct relationship with the world. And we always have to, this darn judgment and symbol and making sense of things always has to come in between. But when you look at other people, like, I often look at my husband and I'm amazed. And I don't know what goes on in his head because he doesn't talk much. He's like very traditional, he's hegemonic, traditional masculinity. He's very stoic. But it's like watching an animal. Like, I'm like, wow, how do you just know how to do things? I feel sick with reflection. I don't know. I come from a world where gender norms, what it meant to grow up, was really confused. I had no idea, like, what it meant to grow into a woman. Not a clue. I was also raised by my dad, which is makes everything worse. So I'd be like, Dad, like, what should I be? What should I do? What should I be? And he'd be like, well, do what makes you happy. And I was like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. I want you to tell me. Give me a script. And I think what happens is there's this sense that, like, the opposite sex has that script, but I don't. And if I could perform their script, then I would have it. I would have a set of rules and I would know exactly how I'm supposed to live. And then I wouldn't have to make a judgment. But this, unfortunately, it's generally our burden to bear as humans, that we are reflective. And obviously the source of all of our freedom and all of that. But as we moved into modernity, we moved into a situation where increasingly the scripts were not given anymore. The paths were not made for us in advance, and we increasingly have to exercise our judgment about every damn thing. Like, nothing is given. Like, the aspiration is to teach kids in a, well, not now, I guess it's passé now, but the aspiration has been that you would teach kids in kindergarten that they could choose even their gender. Even that is not given. You will not be given a script. You will choose every damn thing. And of course, with choice comes responsibility. And if you choose wrong, you are responsible. And who wants that? And so it's very interesting how what was this, like, this discussion of kind of, playfulness and playing with binaries. And so if you look at the kind of the literature and performance, it became very essentialist. It was like, no, this is who I am. This is how I was born. I have a brain, it biologized and so on, which is our new kind of essentialism. No, I have no choice in this. I am not actually exercising a choice. I'm not actually exercising a choice. So it was this sense that on the other side of the spectrum, people really know how it goes. They really know what they're doing. I want that. And when I get there, I will know how to live. At last, I will know how to live. And then, of course, if you look at detransitioners, they will often say, like, once I was there, I was like, oh, it's actually not given. It's not, I'm not a man. This doesn't seem right. And they will have to go back. But when you mentioned before about personality cults, it reminded me obviously of Andrew Tate. And Andrew Tate also offers this kind of solution through gender norms. Like, you feel lost, you feel like, untethered from any kind of certainty. And I'm going to give you this certainty in the form of gender. And of course, as you rightly said, part of the reason why this has taken a gendered frame is because gender used to be the, like, core to our socialization. You would have these rituals, and it's just interesting too that we don't have these rituals anymore. There are very few rituals through which people pass, and that are very meaningful. Like, now I am a man. I remember when I went to university, I was sitting in the lecture hall, and my lecturer swore, and he said, "Oh, you're all adults," and I felt like, this was an important moment for me. I was just like, wow, I'm in the world of adults, the world of sex and swearing and choice. And it was very, very exciting. It was a wonderful, like, exciting thing for me. I feel like now he'd probably get reported or something. You couldn't assume that class of 18-year-olds were all adults. But even that, like, little, like, going to university was like a big step. Now it's like, you have their parents often increasingly coming with them, that kind of thing. But anyway, so the solution frequently is to this sort of being lost in this abyss, this sense of normlessness, or this uncertainty around like how to behave and what are the social norms, what am I supposed to do, what is right, what is wrong, is given to people through gender. And Tate does that. He, instead of giving like a trans narrative, he kind of gives a quasi-trans narrative, actually. He's like, if you just refound your gender, you too can find peace and happiness. It's the same kind of simplistic solutions. But but I think Tate is also a reaction to the scapegoating of masculinity, of toxic masculinity, right? So we saw like if toxic masculinity is the problem, then femininity must be the solution. Let's teach men to be more empathetic. Let's do this in education. Let's unteach men masculinity through this sort of celebration of the feminine. But all this was doing was taking all of these stereotypes, by the way, that feminists had for years been contesting and saying, look, this is what's keeping women back. They're like, no, actually, ladies, those were great. You are actually weak, emotional, closer to nature, closer to instinct, all this bullshit that was being used to keep women out of public life. They were like, no, actually, that's great. Men too should be all these things. Men too should be all this stuff. And so Tate kind of represents a reaction against that, but also through reifying these stereotypes. Like, so instead of recognizing like our cultural avowal of femininity is a lie and a reification of stereotypes that's bad for women too, he takes that to be like what actually women are, and it's bad, and you're a bitch if you're like that. He uses these words. And you should be masculine. You should celebrate your masculine. You should make yourself useful. You should do push-ups and all these sort of things, like refound your masculinity, and that too will be the solution. But none of these things provide a proper answer, because they're all trying to go back to a kind of reified stereotypical masculinity or femininity that used to be embedded in social structures that are no longer there. And ultimately, it won't help. It won't help, because everybody is reacting to a stereotype. And you can just tell how much people don't interact with other humans. Because I remember I got into like this online debate, and every now and then you get these weird people that come along, and someone says, it's because women divide men into successful polygamists and gullible cuckolds that pay to raise the children of polygamists. Yes, of course. All women, the one, your teacher, your grandma, she seemed like a nice lady, but actually she's like, I want that polygamist. Anyway, and you deliberately negged your unfortunate partner, he says to me, by telling him he is weak and stupid, and you cheat on him at any opportunity to get better DNA, which admittedly is better for children on average, or he wouldn't behave that way. This is ludicrous. And like, that this person has not interacted with humans, like with normal people. And he thinks like that this whole manosphere, they think women, the only women that actually, when they talk about women, you know what they're thinking of? They're thinking of OnlyFans models. They're thinking of women between 18 to 25 that are stunning and ultra hot. And they've never considered that there are women of all ages, all sizes, all looks, that like, if you're not a great looking man, go get a hobby and you'll probably meet someone who's also not great looking but super interesting, and you guys can get together. But they're dealing in the whole world of stereotype, and they just get increasingly frustrated. And if you're going to live in that world, you're going to be frustrated. And what we're all doing, everybody across this whole spectrum, is evading a responsibility to forge a path where you actually have to choose how you're going to be, how to get along with other people in a way that allows us to live together. We're not doing that right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there that I want to talk about, and I think we'll do a further episode or two kind of related to this set of themes, because in part we have another piece coming out that'll be relevant to it. But a few things that strike me there is, it seems that part of what you're describing is this kind of gamification of the relations between the sexes, which, sort of has multiple strands, one of which is this kind of, I mean, we could probably talk for a long time about the cultural influence of evolutionary psychology and the way that it sort of, it starting in the 90s, I think sort of supplants a lot of the Freudian narratives with another kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, right? Which sort of argues that, beneath the surface of how we interact in the contemporary world, we're all just kind of these, humans on the savannah, and we're engaged in these sort of mating strategies. And so we have to kind of, look beyond the surface to kind of understand our own instincts. And then this ends up being quite influential on the emergence of these kind of hyper masculinist uh, online subcultures, where, particularly I'm thinking of like the pickup artists and so on, who basically try to turn evolutionary psychology into a kind of script, or a set of scripts, as you're describing, that will kind of give you a sort of playbook for, achieving your, but with the pickup artist, this isn't about like finding a mate to settle down with. It's about, literally just kind of, it actually interestingly goes back to the era of the sort of Casanova, and the sort of era of the great like seducers of, the 18th century or so, the figure of Don Giovanni. But it sort of removes the sort of tragic and sublime dimensions of that, which I could go into, and turns it into this extremely cynical game of just kind of manipulation, and quite sort of charmless, just exploitation. And this was quite a significant cultural strand roughly 10-12 years ago. It's sort of receded, I think, in favor of figures like Tate, who are, who in a sense make those people look kind of, comparatively benign, because they're just trying to get laid. Like he's actually um, doing much more, and saying much more nefarious things. But what part of what strikes me here is that at the same time you have gamification through dating apps, right, as the main way that people start meeting each other, and this kind of application. I mean, as I understand it, this kind of application of sort of, evolutionary psychology and sort of game theory concepts about like the relations between the sexes that are actually plugged into how these platforms operate. And so there's both a kind of a kind of gamification of the intellectual frameworks through which we think about these relations, and then also a sort of gamification of the actual modes of our interaction, to the extent that they're plugged into these types of platforms. And so I think, this does kind of, for one thing, it enhances this sense of a kind of zero sum conflict between the sexes, right? That they become, in a sense, kind of conceived primary, or this area of relations becomes conceived primarily or exclusively as an arena of competition. Now, this isn't unheard of in cultural history, right? There are many cases of this we could find at earlier moments of human culture, where this kind of competitive dimension of, and the pursuit of seduction, interestingly the topic of a book by the aforementioned Baudrillard. We won't get into that now, but it does have this deeper history. But there's a particular version of it that I think becomes highly salient in the 21st century, that's extremely kind of cynical and calculating in the way that it conceives of these relations. And I think that's also part of what underlies this kind of zero sum, this sort of zero sum mentality that I think in its most pathological forms, can be detected in these sort of, both these acts of violence, but also the narratives that emerge around them, and in response to them.
A moment ago, I said that we are sort of evading responsibility. But I don't actually think that's true. Like, I think most people are not in these weird online subcultures. Like, most people are throwing themselves into the the tragic and sublime. They're not thinking about this stuff, right? Um, and most people are forging a path that through which they exercise their own judgment. So, like I mentioned before, that my husband's like very traditional masculine, but in our own lives, it's not like, I think if you start sort of being like, no, a man should blah blah blah, that's when you screw everything up. Obviously, like that's where you're evading your judgment. Whereas my husband's like, he's an ex-professional footballer. He's very like masculine. But he was the one who stayed home and took care of our babies. Like I went back to work, and he used to wear this like what is it? He used to baby wear. When you like, he had it's called a monkey wrap, I think, which it looks like a big pair of yoga pants, like this gigantic, like stretchy material, and he'd tie the babies to them. And he was like, he'd go grocery shopping with the little babies. It was a useful thing, so he would use that thing to wrap the baby on him, and they like to sleep like that, and it was easier to get the groceries done, and it just made more sense in our relationship for him to stay home. And, I think that's what most people do. They exercise judgment, like masculinity, so-called masculinity. I think it's very stupid to sort of essentialize certain human features as masculine or feminine. I think that's how we get into a lot of this mess. Things that we brand masculine are quite useful to people, for instance, in the working class, for particular reasons. And they might be, and more feminized things, so-called feminized things, tend to be more useful for people in the middle class. But people are forging a path. They are able to reflect and be like, oh, this particular thing is causing problems in my relationships and the people around me. I'm not going to do that particular thing. That's how most people do it. But I say, and I do want to be confident that most people are forging this path across our world, without like pickup artists and Andrew Tate and weird rape culture, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and all this sort of like crazy stuff that goes on online. However, I remember, so I mentioned Lipovetsky is writing on hypermodernity, but that book that I'm thinking of, I can't remember, is it just called Hypermodernity? I think it was published in 2005. And he says, our culture still venerates fidelity. Our culture still values relationships and having children. And I don't know if that's true anymore. Maybe I dwell in dark online spaces too much, but I do think even that is starting to fade. Like, what kind of fidelity do we value most? Like, go out and say in a public space, like, I value fidelity to my husband or wife. Sound like a freak. If you say, I value fidelity to myself, yes, you must love yourself first, is what we say. You must love yourself before you can love anyone else. And then it's like, well, and you must love yourself because there may not be anyone else. So I do wonder if even that is fading away. And more of us might get trapped in this world where we desperately desire to go back to a time when men were men and women were women and people just knew what to do, because we are not interacting with other people as much as we were. A lot of us are giving up on relationships and convening with other people. And it's only through forging a path with other people, tempering your wants against someone else's, that we will find a way to live with each other again in a world that doesn't have these certainties. But if we are rowing back from that, perhaps my confidence that most people are actually doing this is misplaced. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think this trend is of sort of hyper atomization and this and the response sort of going back to essentializing gender norms as some kind of answer? Do you think that's sort of going to continue?
I would say at the moment I tend to be pessimistic, just in part because all the indicators seem to have gotten a lot worse since COVID in particular. So, I think usually these kind of trends are, that usually there's a backlash or some kind of counter trend that reverses it. So the question is sort of whether the baseline of sociability and, ability to kind of form relationships and form families and so on is so reduced that even when there's a kind of upswing back in that direction, I suppose my optimism would just be that these cultural trends never just go in one direction. They sort of ebb and flow. But if the baseline is so reduced and the sort of countervailing conditions are so overwhelming, then it will take a lot for it to recover in any meaningful way. So I don't know. I think I'm overall, unfortunately, kind of pessimistic. I mean, there were things like after COVID that made me think, oh, there's a kind of reversion to the norm here. I mean, Saurabh, late lamented colleague Saurabh Amari's forthcoming book on normal, the triumph of normal, kind of starts in part with this observation that, there was a very weird year or two, but there was a sense that things did kind of revert, and there was and I experienced this reversion, very, very viscerally, and it did seem striking to me, given I was myself kind of sunk in this very dystopian vision of where things were going. But what's concerning to me is that it seems like if you look at the overall indicators, they haven't recovered as much as, and and it did accentuate trends that were already underway, and that also, if you look at the overall trends, towards greater isolation, greater atomization, lower rates of sort of forming partnerships, marriages, etc., that it seems that this recovery to normal is still significantly lagging overall, even though in my own sort of immediate sphere, it maybe seemed like it was more pronounced. So that, that seems kind of, that seems concerning. Again, I think nothing is going to just trend in one direction, but the long-term impact of this kind of enforced isolation for a year or two is going to take a long time to measure, and to figure out. So that is quite disturbing.
Yeah, I suppose if there's any sort of lasting remark to make, I would say that if you are feeling a sense of alienation and you feel yourself confined to some anomic existence where you're not certain of who you are, where you're supposed to go, it's best to understand that that's not men's fault. It's not women's fault. It's kind of our condition. It's a condition of sort of hyper modern times. And that you kind of just have to sort it out by taking risks in the world. And that's kind of, I say that, but like, part of what has made a lot of men so angry is like the risk taking that is so central to growing up and becoming an adult, like, having relationships with women, it's become fraught with difficulty. It's like, oh God, can I actually approach a woman in public? Everything's got to be sort of vetted in advance by these awful apps and that kind of thing. But at any rate, it's not, you do have to find some way to forge relationships with people in the real world and change yourself and make compromises and so on. And that's really, I think, the only way. Maybe I'm being a Luddite, I don't know, but I do think that's probably the only way that we'll make our way through this period of uncertainty. And it's probably not a return to so-called traditional gender norms, which were, it's stereotype anyway. It's not, nobody was 100% like lumberjack. Nobody was like 100% fair maiden. Like nostalgia is not going to cure the problems of the present.
Good place to leave it. So thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.
And we will return to this topic, I believe, with a special guest in the coming weeks. Meantime, if you have enjoyed this, please subscribe on the Substack on your favorite podcast app. And again, if you like what you're hearing, give us 5 stars. Thanks, and talk to you next time.